At 2:47 a.m., Adrian Crowe posted something that didn't merely irritate America's allies. It sent a crack through the spine of the Western financial order. Not the headlines order, the real one. The quiet institutional lattice, an interlocking multi-decade alliance of central banks, insurers, courts, and treaty offices, worth roughly $27 trillion in collective gravity, the kind of architecture that has kept markets from tearing themselves apart since the post-war settlement. And here's what nobody on the outside understood. This wasn't a late-night tantrum. It was a deliberate legal and economic offensive built to feel like noise while functioning like pressure. The kind of pressure that, in a prosecutor's world, reads less like politics and more like witness intimidation, scaled up to geopolitics. What happened over the next 72 hours should frighten anyone who has ever watched power move behind glass. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the public narrative and the prosecutorial reality are universes apart. On January 23rd at 2:47 a.m. Eastern, Crowe went on his platform and issued a demand. The Atlantic Alliance partners would pay what they owe or face consequences. No negotiation, no committee. America would decide, alone. Standard bluster, right? That's what most analysts said. They were wrong, because within 6 hours, 3 things happened that no serious institution does for a tweet, unless something else is already in motion. First, the European Central Authorities Emergency Committee convened an unscheduled session. Those meetings don't materialize because a politician gets loud at night. They materialize when risk models start screaming. Second, the Lloyd's syndicates in London quietly suspended new sovereign risk coverage across a block of European states, debt insurance, trade credit shields, the kind of invisible plumbing that lets governments borrow without panic. A market measured in the trillions didn't react. It froze. Third, Germany's High Court, after sitting on a defense spending framework case for months, suddenly accelerated it. Oral arguments were booked for early February, like someone had turned a key and made time move faster. You don't get that kind of institutional velocity from a social post unless something else is pushing the gears. Now here's where it turns prosecutorial. Crowe wasn't just a political figure anymore. He was a defendant. Multiple inquiries were pressing forward: obstruction threads, financial fraud exposure, document retention questions, shadow entities, valuation disputes. Different jurisdictions, different theories, different offices, but with one shared dependency. They all required international cooperation. Bank records routed through Frankfurt, property assessments tied to Scottish registries, transaction trails that passed through Gulf intermediaries and offshore service centers. None of that evidence arrives by magic. It arrives through treaties, intelligence handoffs, mutual legal assistance requests, and the bureaucratic trust that sits underneath the alliance system Crowe had just threatened. Think about that for a second. A target under active legal pressure had just declared economic hostility toward the very institutions that hold the receipts. That isn't campaigning. That's a defendant trying to set the evidence room on fire, and the public treated it like theater. But here's what they weren't seeing. Allied governments started responding almost immediately, just not in press conference language. 48 hours later, the Dutch Ministry of Justice made a statement that sounded harmless to civilians and nuclear to prosecutors: a comprehensive review of pending U.S. legal assistance requests. That phrase is diplomatic velvet over a steel door. The Netherlands isn't a random ally. It's a transit hub of transatlantic legal process, a place where subpoena traffic, treaty cooperation, and sensitive requests are handled with procedural discipline. When the Dutch slow down, entire investigative timelines start bleeding out. Then France's finance minister gave an interview that made every serious legal strategist sit up straight. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't outrage. It was conditional language, carefully framed. France would honor treaties with partners who honor their commitments. Read it again. That wasn't commentary. That was a clause. The kind you insert right before you renegotiate how cooperation works when trust collapses. And then came the piece that should have kept investigators awake. Germany's intelligence service leaked, deliberately, the way a surgeon accidentally reveals a scalpel, that they were reassessing intelligence sharing protocols with nations that demonstrate unreliable alliance commitments. That's not abstract. That's targeting data. That's financial intelligence. That's the evidentiary spine in transnational fraud cases, exactly the kind of material you need when money disappears across borders and comes back clean. So why does this matter legally? Because defendants don't get to dismantle the evidence-gathering machine while they're inside it. If an ordinary person under federal scrutiny threatened the institutions holding testimony, records, or cooperation channels, prosecutors would file emergency motions before the ink dried. They'd call it obstruction. They'd call it tampering. They'd call it intimidation, because that's what it is when the goal is to make witnesses, custodians, and gatekeepers hesitate. But Crow was doing it through foreign policy language and alliance pressure, so commentators called it strategy, like that makes it harmless. Here's what they weren't saying out loud. The Justice Department was watching this in real time, and their menu of options was shrinking. International assistance moves at the speed of diplomacy. A single delay doesn't feel dramatic to the public, but in casework, it's catastrophic. Deadlines slide, statutes close, witnesses vanish, paper trails cool. It isn't cinematic. It's attrition. Investigators had lived this before. Years earlier, a major oligarch case had taken forever. Not because the evidence was impossible, but because the evidence was overseas, and every request had to travel through layered governments with their own interests. When one country slows down by 6 months, the entire structure starts to wobble. Now, scale that dynamic to Crow. One office needs a bank's compliance records, another needs valuation documents, another needs foreign transaction reporting. If a key ally decides cooperation is now conditional, you don't just lose speed, you lose leverage. And once you lose leverage, what remains isn't law enforcement. It's negotiation. And here's the precedent that makes this terrifying. Powerful figures don't always fight charges in court. Sometimes they fight the court's supply lines. In a prior geopolitical standoff, a foreign leader facing U.S. pressure threatened access to a strategically critical base. The result wasn't a clean victory or defeat. It was dilution, delay, compromise. That's how leverage works when prosecutors can't arrest a country. Crow had studied the same playbook, and he was applying it with surgical precision. Now pay attention, because this is where the constitutional crisis actually begins. The Justice Department runs on a belief that nobody is above the law, not as branding, as infrastructure. But what happens when the person under scrutiny can threaten the institutions that make accountability possible? What happens when a target can pressure the treaty networks that deliver evidence? Federal judges can issue subpoenas. They can compel testimony. They can sanction obstruction inside the country. They cannot compel foreign governments to cooperate. They cannot enforce treaties across oceans. If the evidence is abroad and the defendant can poison the diplomatic well, what is a judge supposed to do? Write an order to the wind? This is the nightmare scenario, where the rule of law quietly becomes dependent on whether allies feel like doing favors. And favors can be withdrawn. So let's talk about what this means, not politically, but legally and institutionally. First, that 2:47 a.m. post wasn't reckless. It was strategic. Crow was manufacturing a world where prosecutors would be forced to choose between pursuing accountability and preserving alliances. It's a false choice, but it's effective, because the moment a prosecution team hesitates due to foreign blowback, independence is already compromised. The law doesn't have to lose in court if you can make the courtroom irrelevant. Second, if he succeeds, he establishes a template. Every future powerful defendant watches and learns. This is how you pressure the evidence pipeline without ever touching a witness directly. That isn't hype. That's precedent. And precedent is how systems rot. Third, and this is the generational danger, you're watching the judiciary's limits become visible in real time. Courts can punish obstruction domestically. They can't stop a foreign ministry from reviewing requests until the calendar kills the case. Which brings us to where this leaves everyone. Prosecutors trapped in a shrinking hallway, allies making calculations unrelated to justice, a defendant exploiting the gap between law and power like it's a seam in the wall. From a prosecutorial perspective, this is the kind of confrontation that decides whether institutions endure, or whether accountability becomes something powerful people negotiate like trade terms. Because if accountability depends on goodwill, it isn't accountability. It's bargaining, and you can't bargain your way into the rule of law. You either enforce it or you surrender it. Right now, that choice is playing out, not in a courtroom, but in the 72 hours after a 2:47 a.m. post. Let that sit with you. Stay alert. The next move will tell us everything. In the clip you provided, the core news claim is that a late-night Donald Trump Truth Social post about NATO allies triggered rapid, high-stakes institutional reactions in Europe, and that this should be understood through a legal lens, as potential pressure on international cooperation that investigations might rely on. Those are serious allegations, and they matter because they touch two sensitive systems at once: alliance politics and cross-border law enforcement. Here's what can be treated as solid, attributable fact from broader reporting. Major outlets have documented renewed tensions around Trump and NATO, including allies reacting strongly to comments that downplayed Allied contributions in Afghanistan. What's less clear, based strictly on what you provided, is the evidentiary support for several very specific claims in the script. An unscheduled European Central Bank emergency meeting within 6 hours, Lloyd's of London suspending new sovereign debt insurance for 12 nations, a German constitutional court case being fast-tracked because of the post, and Dutch, French, German moves explicitly tying legal assistance cooperation to Trump's message. I could not verify those specific chain reaction details from the materials you gave me, and I'm not going to treat them as established facts. From a neutral viewer's perspective, I think it's reasonable to feel two things at once. First, rhetoric about alliances can have real consequences, because allies do react to signals, especially when those signals involve security commitments. Second, it's also easy for commentary to overconnect dots. Just because multiple events happen around the same time doesn't automatically prove coordination or intent. There are multiple angles here. People who already distrust Trump might see the post as a deliberate attempt to apply pressure internationally. Others might see it as familiar negotiating by public pressure, with the legal interpretation being a stretch unless investigators publicly allege it. Many people in the middle might simply worry about instability. If alliance relationships get more transactional, cooperation, whether military, diplomatic, or legal, can become more fragile. My balanced takeaway is this: it's fair to scrutinize how political messaging interacts with institutions, but it's also fair to demand hard, documentable evidence before labeling something obstruction or intimidation at a geopolitical scale. The healthiest place to land as a viewer is cautious curiosity. Watch what governments and courts actually do, separate confirmed actions from commentary, and resist conclusions that outrun the verified record.